At 14, my stepmom kicked me out in the middle of the night after my sister claimed I stole her stuff. I slept in a laundromat until my aunt showed up the next morning, dragged me home, and made sure every adult who let it happen regretted it. That night became the dividing line between who I thought my family was and who they actually turned out to be. I didn't know it yet, but being thrown out wasn't just about stolen stuff. It was resentment, favoritism, and an adult who decided punishment mattered more than truth. The memory of that night lives in the kind of slow motion that only happens when a person realizes they are alone in a way they never imagined. The cold air didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, seeping through the thin shirt I had gone to bed in because I thought I was waking up for a simple argument that would end with a lecture and slammed doors, not an exile. The grass felt wet under my socks. I kept thinking someone would call me back, that a door would open, and I would be told to just sleep on the couch or stay in the garage. Instead, the house stayed still, not a single light moving behind those windows. I stood there longer than I should have, as if time could rewind if I just waited long enough. The road looked strangely bigger at night, empty in a way that made me feel like I had stepped out of my own life into someone else's story. I didn't know where to go. I didn't have money, and I didn't have a phone. I walked because there was nothing else to do, moving through streets I only recognized in daytime, noticing details I never cared about before. The cracked sidewalk near the school, the broken street lamp flickering like it wanted to work but couldn't push through. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The distant rumble of a truck somewhere, the rustling of trees, the scraping of my own feet. I didn't think about whether it was safe. I just thought about how it felt like I had been erased from the world I woke up in. By the time I reached the laundromat, it was close to 2 in the morning. The sign buzzed faintly above the windows, casting a pale glow that made the place feel cleaner than it actually was. Inside, the room smelled like detergent and stale heat from machines that had recently been used. The warmth hit me hard, and for a moment, the exhaustion I had managed to outrun settled into my body like lead. I didn't think about sleeping right away. I just walked between the rows of washers, reading brand names and numbers like they mattered, pretending I had chosen to be there. I ended up sitting on the floor near a corner, half hidden from anyone who might look in. The tile was cold through my clothes, but the room had a consistency that felt safer than outside. I pulled my knees up and rested my head on them, trying not to cry because crying would make everything real. I tried to remember what exactly had led to this, but every memory blurred together. Accusations thrown in a rush, hands grabbing my things, the sudden decision made by someone who barely saw me as a person. I kept replaying it all, trying to find the moment where I could have said something different, done something different, prevented it from becoming the kind of night that changes everything. Sleep came in pieces, shallow and jittery, interrupted by the clanking of machines cooling down and the occasional car passing outside. Each time I woke, it took a second to remember where I was, to remember that I wasn't supposed to be anywhere else. The floor left a numb ache in my legs. My throat felt dry in a way that wasn't just from thirst. I kept thinking about how nobody in my house would notice I was gone, not until morning, not until it was worth talking about. The idea that I was replaceable, disposable, settled in my chest like a stone. When the sky finally shifted from black to gray, it felt like the world had thawed a little. I could hear birds somewhere down the street, and the air smelled different, less sharp. I stretched my legs and tried to muster the energy to stand, unsure if I was planning to walk around aimlessly or curl up somewhere else until someone found me. I didn't have a plan. I barely had thoughts beyond staying unseen. The sound of tires pulling up outside didn't alarm me at first. Cars had passed all morning, but something about the slow engine idle made me look up. My aunt's car was parked crooked in front of the laundromat, engine still running, headlights on. I didn't understand how she knew or why she was there, and the confusion hit harder than any relief. She stepped out looking like someone who had lost sleep for reasons that had nothing to do with herself, someone who had been searching, asking, pushing until she got answers. The expression on her face wasn't soft or shocked. It was a cold, controlled fury directed at people who were still asleep in their comfortable beds. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations from me. She simply led me to the car, and I followed, too tired to do anything else. The heat from the vents filled the space, and it made me aware of how cold I had become during the night. I didn't cry, not out of strength, but because there was nothing left in me to react with. I stared out of the window, watching houses and empty streets pass by, wondering how long it would take before things returned to normal, not knowing that normal had no intention of coming back. She didn't wait until we reached the house to start making calls. She made them as she drove, voice steady, clipped, fueled by something bigger than anger. I didn't hear the details, just pieces, names, and the kind of tone that makes people listen. I realized then that this wasn't just about picking me up. It was about making sure that the adults responsible for pushing a kid into the night understood exactly what they had done. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always did, but it no longer felt like mine. The sun was barely up, and the windows were still dark, the silence of a place convinced it had no consequences coming. Sitting there, staring at that house, I knew I wasn't going back to the version of life I knew before. Something fundamental had cracked, and there was no repairing it with apologies or explanations. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew the people inside weren't expecting anyone to challenge what they had done. I just kept thinking about the laundromat, the hum of machines, the hard floor, the strange feeling of being a kid with nowhere to go, and how easy it had been for someone who called themselves a parent to decide that was acceptable. I didn't feel brave, and I didn't feel strong. I just felt changed in a way that didn't reverse, even with daylight. I sat there in the car, staring at that house, waiting for the adults inside to wake up and realize that the night they thought would disappear quietly had become something they would have to face whether they wanted to or not. When my aunt brought me back, she didn't walk through the door quietly. She demanded answers before anyone could pretend they didn't know what happened. My stepmom froze, my dad tried to minimize it, and my sister played innocent like nothing was wrong. I stood there shaking with equal parts fear and anger, waiting to see who would finally say something real. Instead, everyone talked around me like I was a problem they needed to explain away. The air in the house felt heavy in a way that didn't match the early morning light filtering through the living room windows. It had the stale smell of a place that believed it would wake up to a normal day. Shoes were still scattered by the door, breakfast items left out on the counter from the night before, the living room blanket thrown across the couch in a messy pile. There was no sign that anyone had worried, walked the neighborhood, or even opened a door to check a driveway. The house felt undisturbed, as if the people inside slept through a night where no one else mattered. My aunt didn't bother sitting. She moved through the room like someone taking inventory of damage. Her coat still on, keys in hand, posture rigid, she looked like she had no intention of blending into the rhythm of this house. I stood slightly behind her, my clothes wrinkled from sleeping on tile, hair tangled, eyes burning with exhaustion, aware of how out of place I looked against the calm domestic scene. I felt as if I'd been dropped into a painting that someone else had arranged, and I was the smudge they wished wasn't there. My stepmom stood in the kitchen, arms folded, her expression tight with the kind of confidence people wear when they still think they are in control. She didn't look at me the way a parent would after a missing child reappears. There was no shock or relief, just a stiff calm, like she believed this situation could still be framed as discipline. My dad hovered near her, his shoulders rounded, eyes unfocused, looking half awake and already defeated. He wasn't angry or apologetic. He simply looked like someone who hoped silence might dilute the details. My sister leaned against the wall at the edge of the hallway, arms crossed in a mirror of my stepmom, hair messy from sleep, face blank in a way that suggested she had rehearsed how she'd act when morning came. She didn't look at me, not directly. It was as if acknowledging me would force her to absorb the reality of what I had been through, and she wasn't ready for that. She kept her expression smooth and distant, though every few seconds she shifted her weight, a small twitch of discomfort in an otherwise calm performance. I stood there, my hands cold despite the heat inside the house, remembering the way I had pressed myself into the corner of the laundromat hours earlier, trying to stay unnoticed. Standing here now, surrounded by people I was related to but not protected by, felt stranger than being alone in a building built for strangers. At least there, nothing pretended to be family. My aunt spoke with slow, steady force, the kind that didn't need shouting to be threatening. The sound of her voice carried through the room, sharp against the quiet morning. Every word she said landed heavy, even if she wasn't saying them to me. I didn't need to hear exact sentences to understand what she was demanding. She wanted explanations for the night, justification for the decision, acknowledgement of what had happened. She wanted someone to take responsibility before the situation grew into something larger than a family dispute. My stepmom responded with a posture more than words. Chin lifted, back straight, her face shaped into an expression that blended certainty with irritation. She looked like someone who still believed everything could be spun into a story where she had acted correctly. She didn't look guilty or regretful. She looked inconvenienced. She moved her hand across the counter, picking up a dish towel, smoothing it automatically against the surface, as though tidying small things would give her a sense of control when bigger things were collapsing. My dad kept shifting his gaze between faces, landing nowhere for long. He looked like someone who wanted the moment to end quickly, not by fixing anything, but by waiting it out until it became old enough to ignore. He stayed near the background, physically present but emotionally absent, a figure who depended on quiet to survive conflict. His silence felt familiar, not just in this moment, but as a part of my life. It had always been the buffer that allowed others to do harm without consequence. My sister remained almost motionless, still leaning against the wall, but her eyes flickered every time my aunt's voice sharpened. There was a small, nervous movement in the way she pressed one thumb against the other, a habit she had when she didn't know whether she was safe. She wasn't afraid of what she had done, not exactly, but she was afraid of being exposed. Her place in this house depended on innocence, and she had learned early that staying still made adults see what they wanted to see. I stood quietly, the kind of stillness that came from exhaustion rather than choice. Every muscle in my body ached from sleeping on the floor, and my skin felt tight from cold air still trapped under my clothes. I wanted someone to look at me and register the reality of what I had gone through, but no one did. I felt like an object in a story told in third person, something mentioned but not addressed. It was strange standing there, watching people discuss the night as if they were summarizing a situation rather than facing a child who had lived it. They talked around the event, around the decisions, around the danger. They didn't talk about the walk in the dark, the locked doors, or the weight of being sent away with nothing. They didn't acknowledge the night for what it had been, a severing instead of a lesson. I realized then that the people who cause harm often believe their authority outweighed reality. They didn't see consequences, they saw inconvenience. The room grew warmer, not from temperature but from tension, the kind that settles into walls and gets absorbed by furniture. The longer my aunt stood there, the clearer it became that this house expected the night to disappear quietly, swallowed by time and routine. They wanted to wake up, have breakfast, go about their day, and treat my disappearance as a momentary disturbance, not a dangerous failure. But she had no intention of letting that happen. Standing behind her, watching their faces, feeling the shift in the atmosphere, I understood that this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning, whether they acknowledged it or not. And I didn't feel afraid anymore. Not because I felt safe, but because something in me detached from the idea that these people were the ones who defined what safety meant. I stood in that living room with shaking hands and stiff legs, waiting to see if anyone would finally speak truth instead of circling around it. But everyone chose silence, avoidance, and carefully constructed normalcy. They treated the night like a problem that had already been dealt with, even though the consequences were standing right in front of them, wearing yesterday's clothes, smelling like detergent, and carrying the memory of tile floors and fluorescent light. Nothing had been repaired. Nothing had been resolved. But for the first time, it was clear that someone had drawn a line in this house, and it wasn't me. It was the person standing beside me, refusing to let anyone pretend the night was ordinary. It didn't take long for the truth to crack open. My aunt cornered my sister, asking what exactly I stole. She mumbled, contradicted herself, and finally admitted she lied because she wanted my stepmom's sympathy after getting caught breaking something she borrowed. The accusation had nothing to do with theft. It was just convenient to blame me because I was the easiest target. The adults had believed it without question because it fit the story they wanted. The reveal didn't come with a dramatic confession. It unfolded slowly, with a kind of reluctant honesty that surfaced only because someone older, louder, and more stubborn refused to let the narrative drift away. My sister didn't crumble in tears or show sudden remorse. She simply ran out of path. She had built the lie too quickly the night before. Rushed, messy, filled with holes she hadn't bothered to patch because she hadn't expected anyone to look closely. The adults had accepted it instantly, not because it was believable, but because it confirmed what they already believed about me. Watching her unravel felt strange. There was no sense of victory or satisfaction. I wasn't sitting there thinking she deserved humiliation. I just felt numb, like I was witnessing a moment that should have mattered but somehow didn't. I stood off to the side, leaning against the edge of the hallway, listening to half sentences, quiet admissions, and the low hum of the refrigerator. The morning light stretched across the kitchen floor, making the dust and crumbs visible, the kind of everyday mess that felt more real than anything the adults were pretending to control. My sister kept her head lowered, shoulders pulled forward, the kind of posture that made her look younger than she actually was. She stared at the floor like it could help her assemble a better story, but every time she tried to build one, it fell apart. The truth didn't come out in a single moment, but in fragments connected by hesitation. She admitted she had broken something and didn't want to get in trouble. She admitted she thought blaming me would shift attention away from herself. She admitted she had expected everyone to believe her because they always did. She didn't say she wanted me gone or harmed. She didn't have to. The outcome spoke louder than anything she might have said. I watched my stepmom's face shift in small, controlled movements. Her expression didn't collapse into embarrassment or regret. Instead, it hardened. She looked frustrated not by the truth, but by the inconvenience of it being discovered. Her jaw tightened slightly, and she pressed her lips together, the kind of tension that came from realizing her certainty had been built on a lie too flimsy to defend. She didn't reach for my sister, didn't show concern for how frightened or guilty she might have been. She looked like someone whose authority had been challenged, and nothing mattered more than regaining footing. My dad remained still in the background, hands shoved into the pockets of a sweatshirt, shoulders hunched. He didn't look angry or betrayed. He just looked uncomfortable, like he had walked into a conversation at work and didn't know if he should contribute or pretend he hadn't heard anything. His silence didn't support anyone. It simply hovered there, familiar and useless. I kept thinking about the night before, the way my sister had stood in the hallway, sobbing loudly enough to pull adults out of bed, the way she had screamed about theft, betrayal, violation of privacy. She had thrown dramatic words like sparks, knowing someone else would have to deal with the fire. She hadn't looked frightened then. She had looked powerful, and I had stood there, stunned, half asleep, unable to defend myself fast enough to stop the avalanche that followed. Now, she looked small, stripped of momentum. She wasn't rehearsed for this part. The morning after, when someone demanded details, she kept shifting her weight, pressing one foot against the other, fingers twisting the hem of her shirt like she was trying to hide inside it. The truth didn't repair anything. It didn't fix the past 12 hours. It didn't erase the cold walk or the tile floor or the fluorescent lights that had hummed while I tried to sleep sitting upright. It didn't undo the feeling of being thrown out like trash because a story had painted me as disposable. It just sat there, exposed and awkward, leaving a mess nobody wanted to claim. Even after everything was laid out, nobody turned to me with recognition or apology. My stepmom didn't suddenly soften. My dad didn't step forward. They absorbed the truth as another obstacle to manage. My stepmom stood by the counter, arms folded again, posture stiff, clinging to the idea that her decisions were justified even when the foundation beneath them had dissolved. She didn't argue against the truth, but she didn't accept responsibility for reacting to a lie. She seemed bothered by the implication that she should have known better, that she should have questioned investigated, or cared enough to hesitate before pushing a child out of the house. What struck me most was the absence of shock. Nobody looked stunned by the revelation that my sister had lied. It was almost as if everyone expected she might have done something like that, but punishing me had still made more sense than addressing her behavior. It wasn't that they trusted her more. It was that I fit the role more easily. I was older, quieter, less expressive, and easier to blame. I didn't cry loudly, didn't cling to people, didn't demand belief. I was the receptacle for frustration, the scapegoat embedded in the family structure. Standing in that kitchen, listening to the truth being pieced together, I realized how many choices the adults had made were less about facts and more about convenience. They hadn't believed her because she was convincing. They had believed her because the lie aligned with their biases. They wanted a reason to discipline me, to control me, to remind me of my position in a hierarchy I hadn't agreed to. The lie had simply provided a doorway. My sister's confession didn't spark emotional fallout. No yelling, no tears, no chaos. It settled like dust on furniture, coating everything but changing nothing. The weight of it wasn't in the noise, but in the resignation that followed. She didn't say sorry. She didn't look at me. She simply stepped back, relieved that the admission had ended the interrogation. She seemed to believe that telling the truth now would erase the impact of the lie. But I knew the night had changed me in a way that didn't rewind. Even with the truth exposed, the emotional structure of the house didn't shift. The air didn't clear. No one moved toward reconciliation. The adults didn't act like people who had almost lost a child to fear or danger. They acted like people whose mourning had been disrupted by conflict, eager to return to routine as soon as possible. I felt a quiet detachment settle over me. Not bitterness, not rage, just a loosening of ties. I realized I was no longer waiting for someone to fix anything or acknowledge anything. I wasn't standing in that room hoping for softness. I was learning what it meant to stop expecting it. Truth had finally surfaced, but it hadn't healed anything. It had only revealed how fragile the trust had been, how easily it could break, and how little effort anyone would make to repair it. Instead of apologizing, my stepmom doubled down, insisting she did what any parent would do. She tried to make kicking a 14-year-old into the night sound reasonable. My dad sat there with the same useless silence he always chose when conflict wasn't about him. No one admitted they were wrong. No one acknowledged the danger or humiliation I faced. They were more concerned with defending their choices than acknowledging consequences. The house shifted into a space where justification replaced reflection. My stepmom stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her posture rigid in a way that signaled she was bracing for judgment she refused to absorb. She didn't look shaken by the truth or burdened by regret. She looked determined to maintain authority, even if it meant refusing to recognize reality. She carried herself like someone who feared losing credibility more than causing harm. She moved slowly through the kitchen, picking up dishes, stacking plates, wiping surfaces with an intensity that suggested order could drown out discomfort. Her routine movements felt like a shield, a way to avoid eye contact or acknowledgement. Every gesture was controlled and deliberate, as if neatness could rewrite the night. My dad sat at the table, slouched slightly, shoulders drooping, eyes lowered to his hands. He didn't intervene, didn't question, didn't defend or criticize. He looked like he was waiting for the moment to pass, hoping the conflict would fade if he stayed quiet long enough. His silence wasn't neutral. It was a choice that made everything heavier. He had been the adult who could have stopped the situation before it escalated. He had been present when the accusations started, when the anger escalated, when I was sent outside with nothing. His passivity had shaped the night as much as her decisions. There was a strange stillness in the room, not calm but stagnant, the kind that forms after a storm when debris is scattered everywhere but nobody is picking it up. It didn't feel like the aftermath of chaos. It felt like the maintenance of dysfunction. Everyone could see the mess, but no one intended to fix it. I watched the two of them navigate the morning without acknowledging what had happened. They didn't ask where I slept, how I got through the night, if I had been afraid or cold or hungry. They didn't look startled to see me standing there unharmed, but changed. They didn't ask if anything bad could have happened, not because they believed I was safe, but because imagining it would force them to reckon with responsibility. They couldn't afford to see the night as dangerous, only disciplinary. My stepmom's voice stayed level, calm in a way that created distance rather than peace. She framed herself as decisive, rational, unshaken. She leaned on phrases like rules, respect, discipline, household standards, ideas that sounded organized and moral, but had no meaning when placed against the reality of forcing a child into the dark over an unverified claim. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't soften, didn't waver. It held a tone of certainty that made disagreement feel futile. My dad didn't echo her. He didn't contradict her either. He simply let her narrative stand, as if silence was enough to maintain agreement. He kept rubbing his fingers together, a small, repetitive motion he often did when uncomfortable, his gaze moving from the table to the window, never landing on me. If he saw me, he didn't show it. If he felt guilt, he hid it behind routine resignation. He had mastered the art of emotional absence, and he used it now as if it were a shield. I remained near the hallway, my back touching the wall, my hands tucked into the sleeves of my sweater. The fatigue of the night lingered in my muscles, and every breath felt shallow. I waited for someone to acknowledge what had happened, even if only to rationalize it in a way that didn't strip away my humanity. But they didn't. They spoke about responsibility, consequences, boundaries, as if the night had been a controlled exercise in parenting rather than a reckless abandonment. No one described the event directly. They didn't use words like kicked out, alone, unsafe. They said things like sent outside, needed space, consequences for behavior. They carved the story into a shape that made them look responsible, replacing fear with structure, cruelty with discipline. They recast their decisions not as emotional, impulsive, or punitive, but as necessary. They wanted the version where they acted out of principle, not anger or bias. Even with the truth out, my sister stayed mostly silent, lingering near the edge of the kitchen, shifting her gaze between faces without finding a safe place to rest it. She didn't defend me, didn't speak up, didn't apologize. She just blended into the background, hoping to avoid attention. She seemed to understand instinctively that the blame had shifted away from her, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because the adults didn't want to focus on her mistakes. They wanted a story where they hadn't failed. There was a dull ache in my chest, not because I expected tenderness, but because their indifference confirmed something I hadn't fully admitted to myself. Their belief in a lie had never been about evidence or urgency. It had been about their willingness to act against me without hesitation. I realized that being thrown out wasn't a mistake or overreaction. It was a decision rooted in the belief that I was expendable when inconvenient. The house smelled like dish soap and stale air, a bland mix that clung to everything. The heater hummed softly in the background. Light moved through the windows, bright enough to reach every corner, exposing dust and fingerprints, erasing shadows that might have made the morning feel softer. Nothing about the scene resembled the chaos of the night, yet everything inside me felt covered in residue. I kept waiting for someone to acknowledge that the situation had shifted, that the lie had been exposed, that the outcome had been disproportionate. I waited for someone to feel regret, but their priority wasn't to correct the damage. It was to maintain control. My stepmom looked at the world like she couldn't afford to be questioned. My dad looked like he couldn't afford to engage. They had crafted a system where authority was maintained by avoiding reflection. Standing there, I felt the last remnants of childhood expectation dissolve. I had believed, on some basic level, that adults were the ones who recognized danger, protected children, admitted mistakes. But this house wasn't built on those principles. It was built on hierarchy, convenience, and the comfort of denial. Their refusal to apologize wasn't just stubbornness. It was an admission of values. They weren't sorry because they didn't believe they owed me anything. Not comfort, not safety, not belief. I didn't raise my voice or speak my truth. I didn't challenge them. I didn't argue. Exhaustion pressed against every thought, and any emotional energy I had left was spent on staying upright. I existed in that space not as someone who needed answers, but as someone who had already found them. The absence of remorse, compassion, or accountability said more than any apology could have. I wanted to believe that the truth being exposed would shift something inside them, but nothing in their posture or tone indicated a willingness to change. They acted like the night could be rewritten if they held onto a version that protected their decisions. They didn't see damage, they saw disruption. They didn't see a child, they saw a problem. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by people who refused to acknowledge reality, I understood that relationships could fracture quietly. No screaming, no tears, no slammed doors, just a steady erosion of trust, one unspoken truth at a time. And as the morning settled into a muted routine, it became painfully clear that nothing had ended the night before. It had only begun. The night after my aunt confronted, everyone felt strangely quiet, like the house itself was stunned. No raised voices, no fake apologies, just silence, heavy and awkward, like everyone was waiting to see what my aunt would do next, or who she'd target. But she didn't yell, she didn't grandstand. She just watched, which somehow felt worse. Every adult in that house knew she was a ticking clock they couldn't predict. The next morning, she woke me early and took me to breakfast. Just me. No siblings, no stepmom, no dad. She ordered pancakes and hot chocolate and asked in the calmest voice, "Tell me everything they've done. Start at the beginning." I didn't plan to talk. I didn't plan to cry. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her about how my stepsister blamed me for anything that went missing, lip gloss, clothes, money, whatever. How my stepmom never questioned her, just assumed I was a thief. How my dad would shrug and say, "You know how girls are." I told her how they'd punish me for things I didn't do. Ground me, take my phone, make me eat alone. And how that night wasn't the first time they kicked me out, just the first time I didn't immediately come back. I expected anger from my aunt, maybe tears. Instead, she just listened every word with this cold fury in her eyes like she was cataloging crimes. When I finished, she wiped my face with a napkin and said, "You're done living there. I'll handle everything." And I believed her, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't. When we got back to the house, she told my dad to pack my things. Not help me pack. Not can someone get started. She looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Pack every single thing that belongs to this child." Now, my stepmom exploded. "Wait, that's ridiculous. She's not leaving. You don't just come in here and—" My aunt stepped forward, so close it forced her to shut up. "You kicked a 14-year-old child out into the street at midnight because you believed another child's gossip. You don't get a vote. You don't get a voice. You don't even get to breathe without permission right now." For once, my stepmom didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, face red and jaw tight, like a kid being scolded by a parent. My dad tried appealing to logic. We were just trying to teach her responsibility. My aunt laughed. Short, sharp. You don't get to pretend this was parenting. She slept in a damn laundromat. The only reason she's safe is because I showed up. And if you ever pull something like that again, I swear to God, I will have CPS, the sheriff, and every attorney I know crawling through this house like termites. My stepsister, for the first time in her entire existence, shut up too. No dramatic tears. No fake innocence. Just a corner-trapped look because she knew her lies had finally cost something. I didn't help pack. My aunt wouldn't let me. She told me to sit on the couch, eat snacks, and watch TV while they did the work. Because you've done enough already. By the time they finished, I had 3 suitcases worth of clothes I barely remembered owning, books, a few gifts from my mom before she left, and a couple of pictures. My aunt loaded everything in her car, signed temporary guardianship papers she drafted and printed that morning. When she said she'd handle everything, she meant it. Looked at me and asked, "You ready to go?" I nodded, but before I got in the car, I turned to look at the house. Not out of sadness, out of disbelief that I'd spent so many years feeling small in a place that too easily let me disappear. My aunt saw my face and said, quiet, not pitying, "You didn't deserve any of this." She opened the car door for me, and for the first time in years, I believed someone. As we drove away, I didn't look back again. Not at the house. Not at the people in it. Not at the life they swore I was lucky to have. I didn't feel lucky. I felt free and terrified and weirdly hopeful because I had no idea where I was going next. But I knew I wasn't going back. The first night at my aunt's house didn't feel real. Her guest room smelled like clean sheets and vanilla candles, which compared to bleach and cigarette smoke, might as well have been heaven. She didn't hover, didn't interrogate, didn't smother. She just made space. Safe space. She told me to shower if I wanted, sleep if I wanted, eat whatever I wanted. It was the first time in years an adult talked to me like I was a person, not a problem. But peace didn't last long. The next morning, my dad called. Not to apologize. Not to check if I was okay. He opened with, "When are you bringing her back? This is ridiculous." My aunt put him on speaker because she didn't care if I heard. "You signed guardianship papers yesterday," she said. "She's living here now." He scoffed. "That was temporary. You tricked us." "Don't flatter yourself," she cut in. "You signed it because you didn't want me calling the police from your driveway." My stepmom chimed in, shrill and desperate. "We're a family. We should work this out privately." My aunt laughed so hard she actually snorted. "You stopped being a family when you abandoned a child at midnight." My dad's tone shifted, that patronizing calm he used when he wanted to pretend he was reasonable. "She needs stability. Pulling her away only makes things worse." My aunt responded, voice ice cold. "You had 14 years to provide stability. You failed." There was silence. Then my stepsister in the background, loud enough for the phone to pick up. "She's a liar anyway." Before I could even flinch, my aunt said with deadly clarity, "One more word out of your mouth, and I will personally tell the entire school what actually happened with you and that security guard last summer." The silence after that wasn't just quiet. It was fear. My dad tried one last time. "You can't keep her from us. We'll fight this." My aunt leaned back in her chair, completely unbothered. "Go ahead. Call your lawyer. Ask them how the judge will feel when I show photos of the laundromat and security footage of a 14-year-old alone at 2 in the morning." There was a sharp inhale, someone realizing they had no defense. My stepmom's voice turned brittle, like she wanted to cry, but refused to. "So that's it? You're just stealing her." My aunt exhaled slowly. "I'm not stealing anyone. I'm rescuing someone you try to throw away." Then she hung up. Just like that. No dramatic goodbye. No closing argument. Just done. I sat there stunned, heart shaking, not sure if I should be relieved or guilty. My aunt turned to me and said, "You don't owe them forgiveness. You don't owe them explanations. You owe yourself peace." I didn't answer because the lump in my throat made it impossible. The next few weeks were weird. Not perfect, not magical, just normal, which felt like a miracle on its own. I started a new school, made a couple friends, ate dinner at a real table, got a door I was allowed to close. Sometimes I cried for no reason. Sometimes I flinched when someone raised their voice. Sometimes I had nightmares about being sent back. But my aunt never made me feel weak for it. She'd just say, "Trauma isn't attitude. It's injury. You're healing." One afternoon, she sat me down and said, "I'm filing for full custody. It'll be messy, but I can handle messy." And she did. The court dragged on for months, filled with accusations and attempts to rewrite history. But my aunt came armed with evidence, witnesses, and a level of righteous fury that could burn down cities. When the judge ruled in her favor, I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just exhaled for the first time in years. After the hearing, my aunt hugged me and whispered, "You're safe now. Permanently. Not for now. Not until things calm down. Permanently." And that word became something I clung to. Years later, I still think about that night in the laundromat. Fluorescent lights humming, metal chairs cold, my face pressed into a jacket sleeve trying to stay warm. Not because it broke me, but because it didn't. I survived a family who thought I was disposable. I found a home that didn't ask me to shrink. I learned that blood doesn't mean loyalty and love doesn't demand silence. And the adults who once dismissed me, they didn't just lose custody. They lost access. They lost the right to rewrite the story. My aunt didn't just save me. She gave me a life worth living. And in the end, that was the revenge. Not anger, not cruelty, not destruction. freedom. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and lets us bring you more and better stories.